Sorry.
Okay, so thank you for coming to the, I think it's the, just make sure there's no feedback. Yeah. I think it's the 7th Treasury session, 6th. What I will do is briefly present what this is and what Treasury is. So we'll walk you through some of our work as it evolves. And then we'll kind of swing around to the conversation. Like the cost of you doing business here is that you have to listen to me pitch our shit before you listen to these experts. The conversation we're about to have is about legal framing and underpinning of virtual worlds. Barros Chari from Wilson Sonsini, Paul Joseph from Prefina, and Max Sills from Midjourney, and other projects evolving, possibly ours, will share their thoughts on it. Just to give you a sense of what's going on. I mean, Treasury is basically a licensing system for very high value 3D models of buildings and environments. And essentially it's like a Getty Images for 3D content. And our thesis has been, we got funding from a bunch of VCs at the beginning of last year, including Google's AI fund, Gradient. Our thesis is that as spatial computation, right, any digital environment as a business proposition or as a social proposition becomes universal as a layer on top of the internet, quality assets are needed for speeding up development, and because a lot of stuff has just brand or identity value. So it's a licensing machine for creators of digital spatial assets and builders of digital spatial environments. Basically what we've done is created a registry system for assets, discovery system for assets, and a bunch of other stuff. I'll just walk you through a tiny bit of that so you get a tiny sense of what there is. So basically, the registry is basically where if you are an architect or a film studio or a game studio or an artist, someone who has 3D content, you can upload your content, get it fingerprinted so that we have the morphological signature, as we call it, and scan for an appropriate use as digital environments evolve. That looks roughly like this. So you'll just describe the scene, put some basic information in, upload the principal asset, and then what we'll do is we will fingerprint the asset. So basically, once you've set the basic criteria for your asset, you fingerprint it, which means we put a morphological signature on it. If you want to then syndicate it, make it available for licensing, you can do that. If you just want to keep it private, we won't have the fingerprint so we can scan digital environments as they evolve for unlicensed use, similar to content ID on YouTube. So the registry is for creators, and the discovery engine, basically it's a infinite viewing system for digital spatial assets, which also works headlessly. If you have a marketplace, we can supply our assets to you and to use our interface, but basically you can discover and deploy valuable assets there. Right? So this is a little bit pre-launch. We have, in terms of content partners, don't quote this yet, some of the world's top architecture companies, 2 large film studios, some premium real estate developers, and some artists, and we think we will be able to iterate rapidly from there, building license relationships with owners of the best design shit. And as the market evolves, get it licensed out. We think, our first scale customers in the form of, let's say, Epic Games. It's again pre-announcement, but they're building out their marketplace. They want premium assets, and we're well positioned to offer it. They've asked us for assets, and we have probably some asset deployments into the film industry that is converging in different ways into CG-based workflows. So that's a little kind of tiny summary of some of our products, essentially, registry and discovery. Around that, there's a bunch of other stuff, right? We really want to make sure, and we've learned that this is necessary in the last year, that creators of very valuable assets and users of them have the best licenses. This is why Getty Images exists, so that if you're the New York Times, you don't get sued for using a photo within 30 minutes of it being issued, when 100 million people crash the front page when there's some crisis or issue. So licensing ends up being the most important thing. Technology is not that interesting to owners of very valuable IP and users of very valuable IP, and a bunch of other support services to make the ecosystem of digital spatial assets fly. A bunch of specialized things. I mentioned the fingerprinting, but there's some other stuff in there. And then content. It's such an interesting space to be working. And we basically pitched our offer to investors saying, well, if you want to call us metaverse, you can, but metaverse is going to die. We said that last year. And hey presto, it has died and been reborn as spatial computing. And that's an exciting time to be contributing. We think that a spatial layer is going to the internet. A lot of assets will be pulled into experiences. Those assets need to be licensed. We want to be there as that evolves. And this conversation is basically touching on the different dimensions of that spatial computing revolution. Generativity, lore, creativity, different flavors of technology. What is the file format? How do you distribute data? What's happening in the film industry? What's happening in art? What's happening in various domains that touch on spatial computing. So that's what we're doing. You are now part of this piece of work, the content. So that was your update. Feel free to get involved. If you know people or are a creator, tell us. We want to know if you have asset deployments because you're doing VR shit or you are thinking about spatial technologies. Let us know. This conversation is basically exploring the issue of law in virtual worlds, right? We'll fully unpack this. Just to give you a tiny summary of the themes we're exploring, and then I'll hand over to these guys so they can present themselves and kick off the conversation. These are the things that occur to us, and it's worth, I think, discussing and clarifying, even if not all the answers are available. Who's responsible, who owns land in virtual environments? Can I own land as a third party, or is it ultimately owned by the software or hardware provider that makes that virtual environment? What is the responsibility of me for my avatar? If my avatar is AI enabled, what's the responsibility of anybody for NPCs? What happens if there's hate speech? What happens if there's a community chaos event and racist graffiti is scrawled on a wall? These are the things that are, and the questions I think that are unresolved. In our sort of legal sub-series, there are lots of other legal questions related to spatial technology, particularly who owns stuff creatively. This is a broader conversation around the whole environment. What I'll ask is Barath, then Paul, and then Max to kind of share on that theme. Then we'll have a kind of cycle of conversation, but as that evolves, you're invited to jump in and tell us we're all wrong, or particularly me, if you're brave enough to tell these guys they're wrong. Okay, so Barath, what is your frame outlook on this stuff?
Yeah, sure. So the law in the real world is unsettled enough. There's disputes, arguments, laws change, they evolve, they're interpreted in new ways. So then trying to apply that framework onto a whole new technology and a whole new world is challenging to do, right? I think there's a couple of things that I try to keep in mind as I think through what the law might evolve to be and how the law applies. The first is, even though this is a virtual world, it impacts people in the real world, and accordingly, at some level, there has to be responsibility pinned somewhere to something. It can't be like that Spider-Man meme where everybody points everybody else and you end up with nobody holding it back, right? So that's kind of the first principle that I think everybody needs to keep in mind.
Then someone's to blame.
There's always somebody ultimately responsible for what happens. So that is trying to think about how that responsibility gets allocated under the law. There's a couple ways in general responsibilities are allocated or rights are allocated. It's either by the law itself or by a contract, right? And what you would think, and I think we'll talk more about this as it goes, is current laws are kind of imperfect to map onto what happens here in some ways. So you think about your example of hate speech, for example, and here in the States, the internet has kind of developed under the auspices of something you call Section 230, right? The Communications Decency Act, which says a technology platform provider is responsible for the speech that's posted by an end user. That's why Facebook is sued out of existence by the existence of all this hate speech on it. But what's going to happen with, for example, another thing you said, AI-generated content, right? If Facebook is helping you provide the content that's appearing here, are they still just a neutral platform? So there's all these very interesting issues which will come up over time, I think, as we'll talk about.
Oh, thanks, John, for having me. I think the title of the event is really exciting. Raises many questions by itself, but my starting point is really challenging you a little bit to think about how unreal lands are created. What is the legal framework, rules that are needed to create those unreal worlds? And if you are building a platform, a game, some kind of digital environment, the first thing you have to do from the legal point of view, after the technology, the design is in place, you have to figure out, okay, what are the terms of use with regard to the users who are entering the platform and the platform provider. What is the privacy policy, right? So actually we already start with real laws that we need to apply in building unreal worlds, right? And then even though this title of the event is really challenging, thought-provoking, I think it's quite misleading to say that real laws do not apply to unreal worlds. Real laws actually apply, and we really have to find the empirical evidence to show why real laws would not apply to unreal or digital spaces, right? So it's very important for us to understand that the existing legal framework is applicable to digital spaces. The challenge is that these digital spaces, of course, are further ahead in terms of the society, in terms of what lawmakers had in mind when laws for contracts, torts, freedom of speech have been created. So, of course, laws are not perfect, but they are applicable. So we need to, as lawyers, we need to think, okay, what is the part that is applicable, what things are relevant, and what is really the new content. And actually, is this really new digital environment? Is this that much different from the real world? So I think that's a very important starting point. Many questions about avatars, I'm sure we will dive deeper in a moment.
Nice. Hi, I like that. Let me just build off what Bharath and Paul are saying. I'm Max Sills. I'm currently General Counsel of Midjourney. I don't speak for Midjourney. All my opinions are my own. I also run a practice advising startups called Open Advisory Services. So I agree with what Bharath said, that the law is changing a lot. So I have three ideas that I want to just give you. Maybe we can think about, like, why is the law the way it is? And so what really influences me is the law and economics movement, where we think, like, well, the law could be this or this or this or this. And in each scenario, who makes money? In each scenario, who gets hurt and who's responsible? So I don't know what the law is, but I can tell you, like, some of the reasoning behind the law. So for property law, a lot of it goes to who will make the highest use out of a certain piece of land. And there's this thing called the Coase theorem, and that says, like, basically in the absence of transaction costs, private parties will negotiate and make sure that that piece of property or that land goes to its highest use. And so that suggests, like, it doesn't really matter what the law is. The law just needs to be transaction cost minimizing, because private parties are just going to do whatever they're going to do anyway. So that's one thought when we think about, like, what is the law or what should it be? Is it something that imposes a lot of transaction cost or not on parties? John talked about a little bit about liability. So I just want to put out the idea of the cheapest cost avoider, which is who should be responsible if someone gets hurt? Well, it should be the person who can spend the least amount of money to have prevented that harm. I'm not going to say anything else. I just want you to think about that. Like in a metaverse or spatial computing scenario, if there's a chain of people getting hurt, who might be best positioned to spend the least amount of money and time to avoid that harm? And then finally, obviously IP, because everyone's like, mine, I own. There's this like very heavy like ownership mentality. Why do we have IP laws? We have them for a couple reasons. Primarily, it's to incentivize creativity. That's the only reason the government enforces these monopolies, copyright, patent, because they think if they do that, it'll lead to more science, lead to more creativity. And so when we think about what the law is or what it should be with respect to IP, I don't know what it is, and it's changing all the time, but we probably should ensure that as it changes, it's maximizing creativity and not just maximizing the rents that go to people who are lucky enough to own property before the law change.
So I can't remember who I said it to. So basically, our lawyers are Wilson Sonsini, and we are pumping an enormous amount of money in their direction. Barnett is taking none of it yet, but at some point maybe he'll join our group. And I would say, and we're very happy with the work that they're doing. I think Max is going to help us at some point spend less money on Wilson Sonsini if we're lucky to engage Max as an advisor. But in talking through this stuff with our legal group at Wilson, particularly Joachim, who's like the senior partner that runs our team there, I learned something which was very fascinating, which is I was explaining all this clever technical stuff to him, and the assets are here, and then the thing is a conditional, and then what happens if it's the context, and then the platform and the liability, and he was like, I could see him watching, and his brain was basically like some kind of like hydraulic press, squashing down all this kind of fancy shit to, yeah, I'm going to tell you how this works, and they'll be liable, and this is the problem, and it's like, and I was like, holy shit. Lawyers have got a very interesting role in the world, which is simplify things down to operational relations between actual human beings. And so, given that that's one version of what these guys have just said, it's not as complicated as you might want it to be. I'm going to try and make it a bit more complicated until we have to collapse into the pragmatics of it. So let's just go layer by layer, right? Who owns virtual land, right? And we'll take some flavors, different flavors. Let's say an imaginary environment. So let's say there's a tons of different like metaverse type projects that are selling land. What does it mean to own land in a digital environment? In your perspective, jump in, whatever. But we'll start with you, bro.
Sure. So first of all, when you think about ownership of a thing, what is the thing? Right. So what is the virtual land? It's some bytes that exist on a server in some environment, right? What possible ownership rubric could apply to that thing? It's probably, well, is there something copyrightable here? If not, it's really just the fact that you're able to exclude other people from this thing, or you're able to monetize it, which is a matter of a contract. So again, a lot of this stuff, where there are holes in the world, what this all is just an invention of contracts between the parties who are trying to decide economically who gets to control this piece, which is what you're saying, right? Is that a lot of what I think we're going to be talking about here is how to establish kind of a contracting regime that's accepted across an industry and across an ecosystem that does its best to approximate how the world works.
So if there's a digital world, right, where somebody's selling you a piece of land, right, and you have title to that land, right, and there's a whole like universe of propositions there. What happens when their server goes down and that land is not available, right? What do you own? Who is liable? Is that clear? Does that need new legislation? Like when you have a digital object that's sitting on a stack of services such as electricity and internet and servers and compute and memory and rendering, like who's owning what there?
Who owns the responsibility?
Right.
So who owns the responsibility is going to be, again, a feature of what are the promises you've made to the people that are saying that's my land, right? So there's an legal regime, right? You mentioned tort law before, right? If you owe a duty to somebody, right, and you fail to do what you're supposed to, that's negligence, right?
So in practice, the law of ownership for the real world is basically a structure of responsibilities that cascade down, and this is just a version of that, right? Somebody's responsible for something.
It's, yes, I think that's largely right. It's just which laws from the real world apply might vary, and where those laws vary, the gaps get filled by companies.
You're frowning, Max.
Oh, no, I'm listening.
Okay.
Probably I will tell a slightly different story about the digital assets.
Yeah.
So land is one imaginary thing that we can probably relate to, especially if we play computer games. Let me give you another example of personal data, or data that we generate every day. I see many of you have either a smart device in your hands taking photos, notes, or chatting. I also have an Apple Watch, or a ring that tracks my sleep data, and many other apps through which I interact every day. Right? Those apps generate data about me, my location, payments for coffee, chat history, and so on. So the big question is actually who owns information, right? Who owns this digital information? And you all also know the phrase, information wants to be free. So there is economics behind why information wants to be free, because it's like common good, common asset. It must be floating around so that everyone can use and society can benefit. Now, the common agreement with regard to this user-generated data, especially in Europe, in the last 5 years, there was a lot of discussion in the framework of data protection and GDPR. We have heard the rules that determine how companies use information that we help them generate about us. The idea in this conversation was that is it possible that some kind of data ownership concept could exist in terms of legal terminology, right? Digital asset, data, could anyone own it? And the starting point and overall agreement was that data is a non-rivalrous asset, everyone should be able to benefit, and it should not be legalized, right? It should not be considered.
Can you explain to people what
Yes.
non-rivalrous
Okay,
means,
so
just to clarify, because this is key.
Imagine a beach or a forest that belongs to the state, so everyone can come to the beach, enjoy the sunshine, swim in the ocean, and benefit from that, right? So it's kind of common, publicly available assets so that everyone can benefit. So that's information. The idea was that. Also, that's the same framework that we should apply for data, right? Data that we generate in the digital environment.
Yeah, so strictly speaking, non-rivalrous means that your use of it does not prevent somebody else's use of it. In the instance of beaches, that's not quite the case, but please carry on.
Yes. So
An
basically, infinite beach.
Infinite beach, yeah.
Infinite beach. So basically, you can come enjoy the benefits of information on the beach, and others can also come and have a good time. With regard to data, the agreement was that data is like information, it must be free. The practical side of that is, if you look into B2B environment, companies actually generate a lot of data in the B2B environment, also in the internet environment. Facebook collects a lot of data from the users. Some of this data we can reclaim back. Some of this data is locked within the silos. Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and many other device makers for making different kinds of gadgets that we use. So the question here is that, okay, companies have those apps, services, and products. They actually own the data, right? We can have a slight fraction of it that we can retrieve as consumers. Now, the next question is it possible actually that we people could own data that we generate? And the common answer, and I think everyone would agree, well, it's kind of public good, it must be free and floating around. But what we did with Griffin now, we built this environment where every user has her personal data environment. So you can connect the apps, the services that you use to your personal data cloud. Data flows in the background through the API from your sleeping tracker, from your Fitbit, Apple Watch, and other apps. And it really comes to your personal data environment. It stays in your locker. Right? So the legal question is very difficult. Can this data that you now hold from different services, these tiny fractions that companies want to give to you, could you actually own it? What is the legal framework? How do we conceptualize it? The idea is that, well, the starting point is, yes, data wants to be free. And one of the reasons why we cannot define information or data as an asset, because we cannot really define the boundaries, right? What is this asset? What are the limits? If you think about a chair, you can see this is the chair. You can describe that this is the asset. When we think about digital assets, we also need to be able to clarify what is this object we're talking about, what are the boundaries, and what is the economic value. So until recently, the idea of data was kind of left to the public domain, right? It's not owned by anyone. But if we think about new forward-looking data environment, if you are able to actually generate assets from different places into your own locker, it becomes unique asset. It's not the piece that Apple owns, the piece that Facebook has about you. It actually becomes really unique asset that only you have access to. It's defined by the boundaries of this digital locker that you have. So legally speaking, we can make a very strong argument that you own this data. If we talk about virtual worlds, what happens if the server goes down? So it's a technical problem. Legally speaking, it will be still somewhere recorded, right? There will be some kind of digital record of what was in that server, what was in that specific folder. I think that defining the challenging thing is in digital world, we need to be able to clearly define what is the digital asset. We need to define the boundaries. And then if we're able to define the boundaries, we're probably able to build up the argument that somebody owns it. How do we prove it legally? Like, who owns the asset? We can say yes, blockchain can solve this thing, right? We don't need to have a blockchain to record it. It can be recorded in a CRM system, right? So the practical proof of ownership can be established too. So I think there are many more intuitive and direct examples of digital assets that we interact beyond the virtual land in the metaverse, right? There are things that we generate every day, and we really need to think, can I own it actually, and what is required to own it?
So, Max, yeah, I mean, what I was going to say is feel free to carry on, but I was just going to kind of like reiterate, like, who owns virtual environments? Are they ownable? Like, Paul said, well, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, maybe it's a cop-out. I'm going to give a cop-out.
Yeah.
But ownership requires a stable legal regime. So I think a lot of people, like sometimes people get really wrapped up when they ask legal questions, but first we gotta like imagine what happens if there's no law, and if there's no one there to enforce it. What's the default state?
Yeah.
And like, if you look at a developing country with not a stable government, who owns a piece of property? It doesn't matter, because if you come on someone's property, they'll kill you, and then that's the laws. You'll just get killed. So, as a precondition to having a concept of ownership that makes sense for digital assets, we need a legal regime and an enforcement regime that is competent and understands and has a best interest in creating stability between the parties. And then it gets even more complicated. I'm sure you all read like the recent copyright stuff going on in Japan. If you haven't, it's now legal in Japan to train AI on anything. It's like a blanket approval to train machine learning models in Japan. But because we live in a global society, there's no such thing as the law anymore. It's a big competition. Every legal regime is actually trying to sell you their law. And so you're kind of spoiled for choice. You get to pick the law where your customers are, you get to pick the law where you're training your data. So
the law is as good as your jurisdiction.
Yeah, law is a product you buy now.
Yeah, and if there is no stable jurisdiction,
yes, and the quality of the product is based on how stable the jurisdiction is.
Just to clarify one point that Paul made that I think takes us in the direction of like Japan essentially saying that all training data is free of copyright for the purposes of training AI models. Like in like how we define property is some weird hybrid of law and economics and like some squeaking like philosophy underneath it, but it's pretty pragmatic, right? Private property is considered to be possible if two conditions hold, right? But an asset or a thing that is owned is rivalrous. In other words, my use of it excludes your use of it, and excludable, meaning that you can prevent somebody from having access to it. And rivalrousness in data is already a problem because my use of data doesn't prevent your use of data. But actually what Paul was driving at is the excludability problem, whereby even if you have access to my data, I would want to exclude you from using it to retain ownership of it. And that is a much harder problem, right? Because at the end of the day, there are two ways to solve that. One is that you prevent people copying it or you prevent it being distributed, or you have sort of very clever ways of protecting access to it. But once it's out there, how do I prevent you from having access to it? What is the excludability? What is my capacity or a legal jurisdiction's capacity for excludability of your access to my asset? And that hasn't been solved in the data age. And the only way that it is solved is basically collapsing onto law of copyright or some premise of ownership. But it keeps being weakened because people say, well, look, you're going to have to do all these complicated things to prevent me having access to it. And since I'm not preventing you having access to it, why shouldn't I have access to it? And so there's this like engine of resistance to the premises of ownership, rivalrousness and excludability in the digital age. And rivalrousness is just the start to the issue of excludability. And what's happening in Japan is Japan's basically saying, nah, we don't want to exclude people to have access to the data because there is a dimension of value in the data that's better for society to have it, which is the capacity to contribute to a training database, even if you don't use the asset directly. And I think that this is the stuff where law is evolving. Literally, it's evolving. Japan invented this concept legally that you can use copyrighted data for a training data set. And I think if you go back, one of the reasons I wanted to start this conversation is that I think there are these, we'll sort of end the conversation with, but the bits of law that is unresolved, right, is our digital assets going to keep escaping conventional ownership on the basis that they're neither rivalrous nor very excludable. But having that framework in mind is very useful because basically economics and law sort of put philosophy aside and said those two things are what we need, that's what we're going to work on, and they're not very useful anymore in the sense that digital assets particularly are escaping the excludability criterion and they're already beyond the rivalrous criterion. So away from environments onto sort of people and agents and their behavior, let's take an instance of an avatar. And think an avatar where like I'm just literally embodying their behavior and typing in the rude words, and that's a relatively straightforward kind of like liability proposition. What happens if I put my avatar on kind of like autoplay, right? Kind of pre-AI era, but there's some scripted interactions and so forth. And I script it with like rude things, rude words, sexist behaviors, but I go to sleep. Am I liable? Is the platform liable? Is there any liability of some mysterious digital agent in the middle somehow?
What you're asking is a very hard question.
Excellent. That's the point of this event.
Right, exactly. And so I think the key is the premise is somebody always has to be responsible. The buck stops somewhere.
You have to predefine
you
the
have
case.
to right. So for the example you're saying, I think is, and just to play what they're both saying, I think that the place of a platform like yours is, in the absence of laws, you have to build that stable regime on which things can be put, right? And the fact of the matter is, for things like personal data, the EU has taken the lead in saying, here are the rights that individuals have to information about themselves.
Yeah.
And so they've been granted a new property right that in some places does not exist. And by holding that property right, that gives them a lot more control over how their information is shared, etc. I think what you're talking about now is a place where, in the absence of clarity in the law as far as who is responsible, is going to be agreed upon between the people in the ecosystem, and in the absence of anything clear there is going to be a matter of the courts, right? And there's no clear answer. So in the example of an avatar, right?
So law advances if something is not resolved a priori, it's resolved through legislation and litigation. That's how law happens, is it?
It does here, right?
Yeah.
So in a common law system, that's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Having to resort to the courts can obviously become very, very slow and complicated because it takes forever. For example, Google and Oracle split each other, or there's fair use, they're splitting each other back and forth. It took 11 years to settle, right? So, but right, I think that the thing to keep in mind is, if you're the controller of a platform on which this avatar runs, what you're going to try to say to everybody that builds on top of you is, I'm just providing you a platform. What you do with your avatars is on you.
Yeah.
Then I control an avatar and I'm going to rely on an AI system, let's say, to provide me the text. The person that provides the AI system is going to say, I'm just responding to your inputs. It's not on me what comes out. It's all probabilistically determined. They say that, then the person who's providing the avatar says, well, I'm not the one that said this. It came from the AI system. All I did was provide the input. Everybody's
So
pointing
that
fingers
needs
at
to
each
be clarified, is that the point?
other. At some point it does, right? Yeah. Oh,
Just like one quick
Sure,
area. This sounds very similar to autonomous cars, right? Who's accountable for an accident that happens?
Exactly.
If you were to hit the car and you mess with the algorithm,
Yeah.
is Tesla accountable or are you accountable?
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's any existing law around that. Or if we've already solved this problem in a different domain.
yeah, I don't think we quite have, right? So I think that in the case of that, it's a bit simpler to pin responsibility based on general tort law principles, right? So we have already, who's at fault when there's a car accident. This happened actually just a week ago, or maybe hit a dog, right?
So how this is going to get resolved, right, is that the fucking philosophers are going to get sued. Their stupid trolley problems, right? They haven't thought this through properly. And in the end, we're going to chase them down and say, you didn't work this out. There's not enough good ideas for the lawyers to latch onto. But I mean, that's semi-serious, right? Like, you look at the trolley problem and look at that going, and a lot of game theory, like, this is a very bad framing of a problem. That is what you're feeding to the algorithm, right? Because they have to assess, like, maximum harm. Like, if a car is going to collide into a vehicle ahead, and its options are a tree there or another car there, it has to make a risk assessment, right? And that's all trolley problem philosophy, right, that gets algorithmically determined. But somebody made that algorithm up. I mean, it's not just lawyers and jurisprudence and guessing. It's the statistics are guided in a certain direction. Sorry, I interrupted you guys.
First of all, we need to realize that there are so many avatars that we will have in the near future. Some of those avatars will run on top of my own data. Right? They will be helping me to understand better my daily patterns of sleep, my daily patterns of exercise, work. So they will be running really for my own benefit. In some interactions, we will have avatars that help me buy a ticket to my favorite concert, right? They will be just like an agent. And then I think in probably a narrow number of cases, there will be these situations where we have to figure out who's responsible for hate, defamation, or insult, or some harm caused in the digital space. So we need to understand that there is complexity over there. The second thing, I think it's already alluded, but I will try to emphasize, avatars actually are not independent, right? The idea, I think we can have a discussion later, but most of the avatars, most of the things that I have experienced and see what is being built in the market, all of these avatars, digital representations, they are extensions of our identities in the digital space, agents. Right? So we cannot think about it. There is a lot of debate in legal literature. Lawyers talk about independent autonomous avatars. Should they be granted legal personality? And if so, what happens? I think this argument is really conceptual. Probably people have not much to do, just think about this kind of question. I think in most cases, in reality, these are extensions of individuals. Therefore, what we really need to figure out, how do we establish the link between real-world human or entity behind the avatar that works in virtual space.
Max, do you feel on that point, right, that there is no moment at which either the promulgators of the algorithmic machinery or the users that are relying on them to provide kind of like outboard agency, both the users and the platform can say, we don't know why I made that decision, right? Because Sam Altman already says he doesn't exactly know how GPT-4 works and what it's going to come up with a solution. They can train it, right? But there is not a finite outcome. And so isn't there a point at which we back into saying, okay, AIs are agents, I'm going to sue the algorithm?
Yeah, there's a really clear answer to this, actually, I think, which is everything's become corporate law. Everything will be corporate law. So corporations already have free speech. They can commit crimes. Corporations can go to jail. So like, it doesn't matter. We're not going to even have to figure all that out. I just think everyone will incorporate themselves, and then we're going to use that to bootstrap a very organized.
So that's absolutely fascinating, and I think perhaps people haven't said it before, but essentially, if I interpret you correctly, or 1 or 2 steps ahead of the implication, it's essentially saying that agency, we will identify agency when entities have resources with which to remedy harms.
Yeah.
So we don't know if they live. Like corporations we don't know if they live or not, or they have brains, but they've got resources which can be used to remedy harms.
Exactly. And society already works fine. So it's like people can get really upset about when is AI legally or morally or ethically responsible, but just go on LegalZoom, pay a couple $100 to make a company, and then just listen to an AI tell you what to do. The AI now has legal personality.
So if an AI is racist, we dock it a few billion GPU cycles.
That's many. That's like,
we'll carry on anyway. Yeah. So, what about? Let me tweak this a little bit, and then we'll move on because I want to see if we can find like these neat points. So let's take a situation where there's an avatar that has AI enablement, and it's owned by a community. What is the liability scenario there? Right, communities of people can own things, right? So it's your point that the community is the legal entity that
So that would be like a common law partnership.
Yeah.
So, but they should incorporate.
Do you think that sorry, Karen?
I think the point we're trying to convey here, and it seems there is almost a consensus, right? So we can apply existing laws, existing frameworks, century-old doctrines to new cases, right? It's just a new social reality to which we can apply existing rules, doctrines, case law, and then see how we can reinterpret the current environment. One more point, in my space, there is this also debate. Oftentimes people say, property law is outdated, it doesn't work anymore, we should ditch it. It doesn't work anymore. I think this is also a crazy argument, right? Because it's the most foundational argument that powers our current capitalist, liberal, democratic economies, right? If we say that property law is outdated, we're basically saying that our economic framework in which we build countries is not functioning anymore. It's not necessary. So we have to understand that real laws are directly impacting and connect the power of new environments.
One thing I want to pick up on something on Max said, and I think it's something that Silicon Valley really struggles with, is that to make anything work, whether it's contract enforcement or it's the entirety of the legal regime, you need a government that does certain things and is enshrined in the conventional sense in that it has a monopoly on violence and can enforce things and protect its own position from sedition. And those are things that Silicon Valley has a lot of difficulty with. Silicon Valley is literally built on contracts. These guys are fucking minting money. Well, maybe not you personally, but your firm is minting money because everything is a contract. Everything is about how you frame contracts. If one way of describing ownership is this tissue of related responsibilities, all of which are contract-based. And so the question is, if we want to have a digital future, Paul's point is, it's going to be based on actual principles that have evolved into governance and legal regimes that themselves are based on quite old-fashioned ideas about personhood and autonomy. And I find it very fascinating. We've got these very old ideas that have evolved over a long period of time and become institutions. And we think, oh, we're going to innovate our way out of them, but holy shit, we need them to be really robust to do all this innovation.
I think that's right, but the thing to remember is the reason so many companies are built here in this country with these contracts.
Yeah.
Because these contracts are built on a legal regime in a society that puts great value on contracts and their enforcement.
Right.
Build the exact same thing in the country, as you said, where they don't enforce contracts and say, well, it doesn't mean anything. So these things go, it's a virtuous cycle if you're the owner of an asset or a thing, right? But
it's one thing. It's one thing. I think America is a beautiful place, and I'm very iconoclastic in that regard. And I think one of the things that's most beautiful about it is the extent to which, despite all of its chaos and informality, it actually does believe in the rule of law analytically, let alone operationally. So we talked a little about like unreal environments. Let's just kind of talk a little bit about virtual instances of the real world, all right? Because there's a big question out here that is very fascinating. Paul and I, in various ways, work on it. Who owns virtual versions of the real world? How do we describe that? Is it a direct analog of the titles to things, or is there any other subtlety? Because we talked about like the ownership of like the stack of stuff that provides virtual land. What about the stack of things that ends up providing the virtual version of things that are owned in the physical world, and these are intended to be analogs of that?
I mean, I think the simplest answer to that is there's IP or intellectual property, which is not tangible.
Okay.
It's intangible property already, so it can be in the virtual world, or it's the same thing, it's intangible.
2 points. Circling back to what was said before, so we need to have those rules. We need to have those clear frameworks. For example, Japanese rule on data used to train AI models. What Japan is doing, they're actually trying to provide very clear answer to people who are building new solutions that in our legal framework, and I know I spent 7 years in Japan, I know how they work. They probably looked into the 2 frameworks that Japan is mostly excited and following. The European framework is currently trying to adopt new AI-related regulations. In the United States, it's like an open market, right? It's really trying to facilitate the economy and then let the new companies build new things without a very clear framework. And then later on, we will figure it out. Japan thought, well, if the United States are having this very open and clear framework that also facilitates innovation, Europe tries to figure it out. Maybe it would be advantageous for Japanese economy to provide very clear rules and also show thought leadership, attract investment, and it's a legal game, as Max said. The second thing, what was your question, John?
So my question was basically, if you have a virtualized version of the real world.
Yes. The idea here is that the legal framework in many cases is created in a reactive way. Mm-hmm. So after things have happened, we are trying to create some kind of rules based on accidents, cases, incidents that already occurred. As we are moving forward, we need to think about new frameworks. So based on what we know and trying to anticipate what's going to happen, there is so much uncertainty, we really need to think out of the box. What kind of framework could we build so that we anticipate the new technological revolution? That's what Sam Altman is trying to say. For them as a company, it's really hard to figure out internally what is the legal framework for their own company to self-regulate. Therefore, he is running around the world and saying, we need regulations, right? He says, please provide us this framework. It's cheaper for us as a company to comply than to think internally about the rules we're trying to enforce ourselves. So the idea here is to build those new worlds, new frameworks. We need to move from the backward-looking, ex-post mentality to forward-looking. So what kind of things we can do, what kind of frameworks we can create to facilitate new worlds.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I think those are brilliant answers. I like what you said, John, earlier about we're looking for just a concept of ownership, so we'll just try to dig into existing laws and try to come up with them. But maybe I think crypto provides a good example. Who owns virtual versions of real world things? I think first there needs to be money. Where's the money? There needs to be an active market of people transacting. And I think the law and the regulations, as you say, we're very reactive as a society. It will be a lot of wasted energy to try to think of this now. Better to just copy a bunch of buildings and try to sell them and see if anyone is interested in experiencing them in a virtual way.
Well, so we haven't signed the precise document, but Max is in theory becoming an advisor to Treasury, and the fire hose of knowledge and schooling that he provides me whenever we meet is fucking intense. And the last conversation we had was basically, don't do all these fiddly things that you want to do to arrange the contracting liability flow of the Treasury licensing model. Just set it up so that the liability is resolved after the fact through insurance and through just kind of a cascade of logic. And that lawyerly way of thinking, which is things will work themselves out allow them to work themselves out. Don't try and preempt everything. Just let things take their course.
Yeah. Well, and but also to be like pessimistic. And I wasn't this in our conversation, but I could be here. It's really hard to make money. It's really hard to be successful. I know a lot of people with really good ideas that they spend all their time and energy worrying about what could go wrong, and then they don't have any more runway. So I think in terms of like probability, it's much more likely that you'll go bankrupt than you'll make something interesting or revenue generating enough to worry about the law. So I would like people to focus on trying to make money and make good things. And then, God bless you if you can do something that upsets people enough to require legal advice.
Thank you. Business. Thank you. Yes, I've note taken. So there's an interesting issue. There's an interesting issue that is emerging here, and there's been some kind of play out of this. I don't think it's resolved in social terms, at least. Even though there's a legal framework for it, which is like collective data that is generated by people doing lots of things together, right? And that will particularly be accelerated by the further development of these virtualized versions of the real world. Like if what you're doing is tracking people's traffic patterns or where they move or how they use energy, there's lots of value that can be extracted from that. Is that owned by the individuals? Is it owned by them collectively? Is it owned by the spatial owners of the physical environment in which they do these things? Is it owned by the digital environment in which that data is captured? Like that seems to me to be an area where it's not 100% clear, at least how to work it out in value terms, let alone in ownership terms. But to give it like a clear example of how that has caused some interesting problems. Like so, Google or Alphabet had a company called Sidewalk Labs, which was one of their big multiple bets that they invented when Google became part of this larger parent company. Sidewalk Labs was intended to be like the digitization of the built environment, super company. They had a ton of interesting projects going on. Their flagship project was a massive development on the Toronto waterfront, and they wanted to capture a lot of data from an urban district. They could not get that by the community, the self-appointed representatives of the city, because they said, you're stealing our data. And people said, well, it's not really your data, but we want to give it back to you and we'll share it, and they couldn't work it out. And not only did the Toronto waterfront project collapse, fucking Sidewalk Labs disappeared, which I think is extremely unfortunate, and why I think these questions need to be resolved in a sensible way, because you might disagree with how Sidewalk Labs wanted to use the data, but Sidewalk Labs was committing to the largest timber development in history, like timber construction development in history, which everyone who does sustainable design is community-oriented might be in favor of, but they killed that whole thing because they couldn't work out who owns this collective data flow and how it plays into virtual environments. Where do we start with
I'm going to start with Paul, because this is that under alley, but what are you trying to go on?
I think one example is here. We talked about with John about ambient data. So if you saw Apple most recent release, there is a lot of information around us, right? So when we use this new Apple device, we will also generate new types of information about my environment, my life. Even now, if you take a photo, I assume Apple devices already, or photo cameras installed in most cell phones, already can sense what kind of objects are in front of us. Are they wooden? Are they metal? All of this information, who owns it? Whom should it be allocated? And I think the idea here is related to what Max said about the least cost avoider in the case of liability. In the case of ownership, the same principle applies. Whom can we give rights to use this information so that there is least amount of cost necessary to generate value? Right? So who can utilize the asset in the most efficient way? That's a very high level economic regulatory logic behind it. Right? So if an entity or individual is the primary beneficiary who gets best value and can utilize this asset in the best way, probably that's the most justifiable reason to allocate this asset. And as we move forward, I think it's very hard to establish a clear rule for every specific situation. We cannot have one rule for everything.
Okay, so I get the general idea, right, that who can get the most value out of a newly emerging, maybe collective asset should be the purpose that has the right to allocate it. But what happens if Google's capturing it on behalf of other people, right? They've got it, I mean, you can say that it should be owned by the people that can make the best use of it, but it wouldn't exist without Google capturing it, right? So how do you?
I think that's what I was trying to say. To figure out new types of use cases, we need to look into these use cases on a case-by-case basis. When we think about Google, I think there was a little bit of mistrust and miscommunication, right, in terms of how this project was created. I don't know about the details, but I can imagine if they had spent more time sitting at the round table, probably some kind of agreement could have been reached. There was a bit of antagonism, fear involved, so I think that's why the project didn't work. But the path forward here is to think about specific use cases.
You've provided a perfect example of real law stifling on real land.
Right.
I think that we've seen that countries take very, very unique approaches to how their real laws should apply to unreal land. We've talked about Japan, talked about GDPR. In the absence of that real law, then it's a company like Google coming here and in some states can do a lot more. In some states can do a lot less. So there's a value judgment that a society has to make, is that are we going to be the arbiter of what can happen in that unreal land, and we're going to impose a real law to say here's what you can and can't do, or are we going to allow the companies and the people to decide amongst themselves and sort it all out? We've seen how different countries respond to that.
Go. Yeah.
Hey, yeah. Well, I'm Shannon. Hello. One thing that I was kind of curious about is earlier you've been talking about how it's good for a startup to not necessarily think that much about legal frameworks because, if you make money, great. And then alternatively, if you're thinking about it from a legal systems perspective, it's better to think of it in precedent or like empirical examples when a contract has actually happened. You review it later to see if it's legal or not. So in all
Are you a
cases,
lawyer, Shannon?
Sorry?
Are you a lawyer?
No.
Okay. You sound very knowledgeable about this stuff.
Great,
Have you been sued a lot?
Well, I guess my main question is who is responsible for actually creating or thinking through these laws or thinking through the legal implications of their work? It feels like every answer is like someone else is responsible or will be responsible later. So, yeah.
Can I guess what your answer is going to be? But then you actually answer it. I mean, my intuition of where your answer might trend is it's about risk appetite, right? You do not know in many instances how the law will play out. And in the end, you think, I might be liable, here's my potential liability, I'll have a go anyway. Is that not?
Yeah, I think so.
There you go.
But
that's right.
I think there's
That's what I'm saying. You should continue. I should just tell you.
I have an image when you're talking, and I imagine it's like we keep dropping my phone on the ground, and we're like, wow, how is this happening? What is the law of gravity? This can't be happening. Or like, what should it be? Who's going to decide? But every time we drop the phone, it keeps falling. And the thing is, like, so if there's a precedential thing, we're talking about common law systems, people look back. But human behavior just keeps happening too. So like the law of the contract, it's not just necessarily we're going to review it later. It's, do you trust the party that you're working with? What kind of, like, what was the negotiation process like? How did you come up with the ideas that were going to lead to the contract? So it's important not to confuse the law, which is like an idealized system that we have to resolve disputes, with the reality of people are behaving constantly, and they don't need a law. They're just going to keep doing it.
I also think a really important thing to remember is that approach makes a lot of sense, kind of unsettled in new areas, but where the law is kind of clear, that's not what you do, right? Mm-hmm. So if you know that I can't rip a bunch of CDs and start a streaming service, I'm not going to rip a bunch of CDs and start a streaming service and say, oh well, who knows, I'll get sued and figure it out, right? Because I'm not going to get any investors or any. So it's also important to put the rubric of what's actually known and thought of and ensure that when you're building a company, you're going to build a company that's going to pass the smell test, like some EC firms, expensive attorneys are reviewing.
That's such a smart thing to say. I'm sorry, I didn't. Thank you for caveating what I was saying, because it would be irresponsible just to listen to what I'm saying and not. So you can think of your behavior as like you're kind of like sampling reality for new information. And as Bharath was saying, like there are certain examples where you don't need to sample reality. Like, you don't need to touch the hot stuff because you know it's going to be hot. So I'm talking more about like you've never. It's not a stove. It's something else. Then you can touch.
Spaceship floating
It's a
down.
spaceship. Then you can touch it.
I think it's actually very useful, like to remember, particularly in like in the world of the Enlightenment, in the realm of the Enlightenment tradition, where people are sovereign, they're on sovereign structures, people are sovereign, and you resolve whatever society is on top of that. Is that the law is not intended to be a moral injunction, and this is really fascinating. If the law says you shouldn't murder, if you go ahead and murder, you are not in a state of crime until you're convicted. Like, as far as society is concerned, this is fascinating. You are innocent until you're convicted, even though you know yourself have done a bad thing. Law is not a moral statement, and it's not a moral injunction. And I think that's what's really fascinating about seeing law in those terms, is that it is inherently reactive. It can be preemptive in the sense it tries to, it preempts remedies or structures of handling for things that shouldn't be done, but it isn't a system for stopping you doing things. And that to Max's point, is that if you're asking, how do we work these things out, I think the law has a kind of little seed of wisdom that is relevant to Enlightenment-based societies, which is people are just going to do stuff, and they have to do stuff, and that leads to like the innovation premise, which is in the end we do stuff that we didn't know we were going to do, and some of that's good, not all of it's bad, right? And I think that it is kind of a good thing about the way societies are structured, is that we want to prevent bad things, but we don't know everything everyone's going to do, so we cannot create injunctions preventing infinite.
Actually, to flip it on its head, the law should be, going back to the Coase theorem in the law and economics movement, the law should be reducing your transaction costs and making you feel more confident to engage in transactions. So what's really interesting to me is if you or other entrepreneurs are unsure and if they should engage in certain transactions, I would see that as a failing of the law. Somewhere in our society, we're not doing a good job, because it should be absolutely clear so that you're incentivized to make money and improve and be productive.
To that point, I went at the event where I met Paul and Max. It was an event on AI law and generative law. So I met a professor called Jacques de Wera, who's like a professor of international, kind of mainly IP law, but other kind of law, including contract law. And he said something very interesting at that event, which is, look, if you want governments to help get this stuff working, put preemptive structures in place to facilitate operationally fluid outcomes. So, for example, the example he gave is compulsory licensing. If a new asset comes into existence in a new domain, you've got to license it. You own it, but you have to license it. And if you don't license it within a certain time frame, the price is set externally, for example. Right? And so that would be a resolution, I think, Paul, to your point about like Google and Alphabet and the city, which is the data's going to come to existence. It has to be licensed. It has to be licensed free back to the people that created it and other individual users. And then you get into a whole interesting area where if I get it for free, by definition, am I not owning it? Am I owning it? Anyway, so you had a question.
I wrote something about this like a year and a half ago, related to the metaverse, about how borders may extend into...
Given that you wrote to me, you have to say who you are and where it is, so we can check.
Sorry, what was that?
You have to say who you are and where it is, what you wrote, so we
My
can
name's
check.
Eli. So I wrote a report about the metaverse investing, like an investment thesis at a fund I was at. And essentially I was trying to like understand and think about how, the future rules and laws, regulations are going to extend into the metaverse, right, from the physical world or IP and other things. And I just kind of like had a thought experiment about like how U.S. citizens in the metaverse would sort of coexist with, let's say, citizens in China. And let's say we're like watching like a matinee or like a movie theater about Winnie the Pooh, or playing Fortnite. At some point, like after 3 hours, the citizens in China aren't going to be able to play this game, right? And so they're going to be shut off. Or if I'm playing on South Park or something, they're not going to be allowed to watch that. So is it censored, or how does censorship sort of like prevail across, like immersing ourselves in this world of content, right, in media? and what's that going to look like? And so are certain, are you going to have digital passports like biology sort of like talked about with the network state, where you can just sort of like go from country to country and sort of like adopt that local, hyper-localized jurisdiction sort of legal framework and have to abide by those local regulations, and they may be very specific to either the country or even to a very local government like the county or even smaller. And so what are those going to look like? How are smart contracts going to play a role in that? How are governments going to be enforcing what sort of content or what transactions we're going to be engaging in, and where are those going to be like stopping it? The Great Firewall is a literal sort of barrier between us communicating with people from another country, and how is VR or AR going to sort of like create that sort of connection, but also where those barriers are going to start like stopping us from coexisting or transacting.
So we'll start rounding off gradually. Feel free to come up with more questions, but just let me reframe this little tiny bit. Is there a international legal regime evolving? Everyone can share that. In your experience, is there an international legal regime that's evolving, or as you say, is it a competitive dynamic where different jurisdictions are saying you can do this here and you can't do this here, right? Because Eli's point is basically, is there something evolving that is sufficiently coherent that multiple actors from multiple states have a harmonized regime in which they can be governed in the virtual space?
Both.
Right.
So as you said earlier about like monopoly on force, there is like a militaristic, there is a real. So there's both the competition for laws going on right now, in my view. So it's really unstable. I don't think there's an international consensus at all. But there's also fighting. People trying to externalize their laws and trying to make their laws apply extraterritorially. And yeah, it's just a really interesting and uncertain time that's going to be like really messy.
Can I throw in a little adjunct to this? I'm no Mark, media and entertainment fan of Treasury. Is there a trend towards transnationalism, towards blocks forming in which laws could actually coalesce to a meaningful new order, at least within the bloc? And because as an individual nation, it's not enough to get gravity, but could blocks form?
Let me answer that question. I used to work in the United Nations. I worked there for 4 years. And so I can tell you from the perspective of multilateral governments, right, there are multiple tensions going on. Essentially what happens when governments try to pool their sovereignty, they end up in a situation where they're happy to have some kind of collaboration, but they don't want to give up individual sovereignty, right? So what ends up happening with the UN, for example, is you have very weak coordination regimes that ultimately break down because individual governments refuse to be subject to that regime. And the primacy of the nation state is a very good analog to the primacy of the sovereign individual, and it's very hard to break down. And when you have things like the European Union, where you do have a lot of sovereignty pooled, you see what Britain did, it says, fuck that, we do not want to pool our sovereignty, go out of it, right? And so pooling of sovereignty is the main issue, because you have all sorts of multilateral things, but enforcement of that beyond a nice idea that we're going to do ends up being the main thing, when it becomes like a binding piece of legislation that needs to be translated down to the actual enforcement regime, because multilateral treaties and law don't have what governments have, which is enforcement systems. Laws only make sense if they have monopolies of violence to enforce them, and that is the domestic situation with most modern governments. There is no such thing internationally, and that's why we don't have world government, because no one would accept, if pooled sovereignty was to be truly a thing, that there's actually any sanctions for getting it wrong. The only organization that's ever achieved that is the World Trade Organization, and they do have effective sanctions, but the US breaks out, and China breaks out. They bust their own regime. So what ends up happening is basically hegemonic regimes rather than multilateral regimes, where you have a powerful actor that gets a group around them and says, we're all going to do this, guys, aren't we? And we all go, yes, because the hegemon, as it's called, says, I'm going to fuck you up and you don't do what I want. And that is often paralegal in the sense that it isn't treatyized, but it is super effective. And most international relations relating to US dominance in international legal regimes is a paralegal issue of people's trading or client status in relation to the US. So it is not multilateral regimes that truly work, it's hegemons that enforce their will. But that's a quick summary of how this shit works there. And it doesn't work very well. But what is happening is technical regimes are forming that where standards are so useful to everybody, like TCP/IP is the internet standard, that even China doesn't try and screw with it. They build their great firewall on top of TCP/IP. We have Ethernet in China. They do not have their own internet. France had Minitel. They don't. We all have Ethernet. So there's a different way of universally legislating through standards, and that's another conversation. De facto standards are actually the most universal phenomenon in the world. It's why the World Trade Organization has sanctions regime that works, because trade has standardized and runs everything. So that was a quick summary of international law. So back to the question of, what was the question? So like international regimes.
Right. I think that it's hard to expect the virtual world to have a level of conformity that the real world doesn't even have, right? From a philosophical perspective, right? There's standards-based work that's done that just largely done around communications, interoperability to make sure things work and things can talk to each other, is where standards come in. But when it comes down to what things should say, cultures have wildly different thoughts on what should be said, what should not be said, what should be owned, what should not be owned, how it should be owned. It's not going to be standardized. It's just it's not standardized now in the world.
I can give an example of a standard in a legal framework. Many of you have probably heard about Creative Commons. It's a license framework that you can choose if you are publishing something online. Maybe it's a blog post or a photo. It's some sort of a international legalized framework that allows creators to choose how they want to share their content. Do they want to share it publicly without any restrictions, or do they really want to make sure that the work they release for massive audiences is somehow used for certain purposes, or maybe they also get a reward. So this Creative Commons framework is built on shared values of people, of global community. Brazil, China, European, Global South, all kind of cultural environments subscribe to this idea that authors should be able to determine how their works are distributed. If they do not choose in advance when they release their works, then the default rules of that specific country will apply. But also the Creative Commons has been transposed into domestic frameworks so that when people exercise their rights, there is still a state-backed system. So that if something happens and then a Creative Commons license that is attached to my photo or my text that they publish online somehow is not followed, then I can still rely on domestic laws. So we can, I think one of the nice optimistic summary of the discussion here is that as these new, amazing, challenging, exciting things are happening and emerging, of course, we are living in the current environment, but we can also see that some, let's say, actor-driven approaches are emerging. These actor-driven approaches are oftentimes set by companies that are building frameworks. Frameworks are determined by terms of use, and then some other additional contract-based or, let's say, user-based agreements. One example is Treasury, and then I think we see something happening in data field as well. So, things are exciting, challenging, but it's not that it's like there is no light at the end of the tunnel. As the society evolves, we are thinking like, what are most efficient governance frameworks that we can create?
So let's run up with this question, and we'll go from you, Max, to you, Brad. Like, think of in the next, let's say, 5 or 10 years, right? The most surprising or interesting thing that will happen in law, i.e., of a positive sort rather than a negative sort. The European Union is causing lots of problems with restrictive legislation, but constructively, and is that interesting but also useful? Is there something that will happen in regulation or jurisprudence or technology or even the philosophy of law that will happen in the next 5 or 10 years that is unexpected and interesting and we should be looking out for in general terms? Next. And if no, that's fine. The law is just going to chunter on and it's all going to work itself out.
I think there's going to be 2 trends that I see. One trend is massive economic upheaval as people's jobs are automated.
Yeah.
And like you were saying at the earlier, Paul, like, that's the foundation of Western liberal democracy. How could they possibly question it? But I feel like they will, but like people are going to question if they're going to be met. So that's going to be one trend. But I also think that if you think about, you can think about the legal system as you go to it and give it a good argument, and then it allocates you resources. Try to persuade it with rhetoric, and then you get the money or the land. But as LLMs get better, rhetoric is going to be democratized. So what kind of society do we live in where everyone, no matter how rich or poor they are, can make exceptionally smart arguments to legal systems? I think we're going to see, like, so from a legal perspective, I think we're going to see a really chaotic period, and then maybe like exceptionally good rhetoric from everyone, which is going to completely overload the legal system. And then that, I don't know if that'll be positive, but it'll be very exciting.
Everyone's going to be able to advocate for themselves way better. Basically.
Exceptionally, yeah.
Cool.
So I will add 2 more points to Max. One thing, I think actually Europe is doing not that bad of a job. As we think about the forward-looking regulation, one of the exceptionally amazing things that Europe is trying to achieve, it's not really easy, but the current proposed EU AI Act does some kind of innovative thing. So instead of establishing very clear rules-based approach, there is a risk-based approach. So basically activities, data, AI, machine learning related activities are categorized in low-level risk activities and high-level risk activities. And those that are more risky for the society, they have to meet higher threshold, higher standards. So it's kind of, I think, a very big, dramatic transformation in terms of how law is evolving. And the second thing, I must say that it seems that as we talk about technologies and data, there is some transformations happening with regard to human-centric approaches. So we are shifting from product-centric environments where we have several companies that dominate the world, and we are probably moving towards more decentralized, democratized environments that are really built around individuals, so that people have more autonomy, more determination, how they want to utilize the information, how they want to benefit from the things they co-create with all of these new autonomous agents, machine learning tools, and so on.
So I think the thing that's going to be extremely interesting is as AI and its power just become more pervasive and prevalent, and everybody sees how it impacts their life every day, every way. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how different countries' legal regimes address the question of transparency, right? Just to understand, not only is this thing AI or is it real, or was this changed by AI or was it real, but also when I'm talking to an LLM, I'm not talking to a base model, I'm talking to a model that's been tuned on top of stuff where a lot of people made a lot of choices to say, here's the type of answers you can and can't give, here's what it says, and to understand what the regime will be around that, and to see how that regime will vary a lot based country on country, based on what its own internal philosophies are and what, right? So Creative Commons, for example, right? In a country like here where there's a strong First Amendment, I think there'll be a lot looser rules around transparency. In China, where I can't post a cartoon about Winnie the Pooh or can't write an article about Tiananmen Square, it's going to be a lot different, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see how different countries pass these laws and how they impact unreal lands, because that's where all these countries are going to come together. It's going to be really interesting.
So I say thank you to these guys in 1 second, just to add my little piece of this. I'm not a lawyer, but it turns out that Treasury is primarily a legal project in the sense that people's IP, the creators of IP, is such a profound concern, how it gets used, how it gets ingested into training models, and looking at like the IP structure whereby you have copyright and trademarks and patents. I think intellectual property is going to have to be evolved for the digital age. I think we can start to see that with Japan legislating that it is not just fair use, it is fair game to have models trained on copyright data. I think we need a much more digital-oriented IP regime, because ownership of data, as we've described, with through non-rivalrousness and non-exploitability, is a major problem that society is not solving constructively. We have more of these events, and you're welcome to them. This is like an experiment to host high-end conversation and sort of seed our business model into it and bring interesting people around us, but also add value. We're launching a sort of second event concept, which is basically much more interactive, less fucking lecturing, and much more demo-oriented and interaction and creativity-oriented. You are welcome not just to come to these, but to help us invent them. Right? If you know people or you have themes you want to engage in around spatial computing and creativity for spatial environments, please jump in. This event space is for you. We can't justify it as a laptop-oriented company. We don't need this space except for anything that involves engaging people in sessions and demos. And that's how you get involved, basically. These two slides will be visible as we drink and continue. Feel free to engage. There's tons of ways to engage. Ask me, Shawnee, Director of Marketing, Tim, Head of Community, or our various advisors who are around the room. And thank you for coming. So, Bharath, Paul, and Max, thank you so much for being with us a masterclass in